Jesse James steps into the room. He already knows Robert Ford is going to kill him, but he takes off his gun belt anyway, fixes a picture on the wall, then turns his back. No music, no words, just fear. That's how The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford plays it. Quiet, slow, and devastating. However, it flopped so hard in 2007 you'd think it got shot in the spine. But now, it's practically holy scripture for film nerds. Directors worship it, cinephiles hoard it, and it's not alone. Some westerns got buried deep. Wrong era, wrong tone, too brutal, too artsy. But time has a way of digging up the good stuff. That's why this episode is going to unpack 5 westerns that rose from the ashes. Westerns that were ignored, hated, or laughed off, only to come back swinging as cult classics. So strap in, because these legends took the long way round. My name is Sam, and this is Western Files. And first up, the Western that killed a studio, lit millions on fire, and somehow came back as fine art. Number 5. Heaven's Gate, 1980. Michael Cimino had just made The Deer Hunter. It won Oscars. It made grown men cry. So Hollywood, in all its wisdom, handed him the keys to the kingdom. No rules, no budget cap, no one telling him, maybe don't spend a week filming a guy ride a horse into town. So what did Cimino do? He lit that blank check on fire and built Heaven's Gate out of the ashes. The budget started at $11 million. It ended at $44 million. He shot 220 hours of footage. That's 9 straight days of film. And it wasn't just overkill. Cimino tore down sets after shooting them. He relit scenes for no reason. Rumor says he spent an entire day filming one entrance. One horse entrance. Meanwhile, United Artists, the same studio that gave us Rocky and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, just stood there watching their wallet bleed out. And when the film finally dropped in 1980, it face-planted $3.5 million at the box office. That wouldn't even cover production services. Critics ripped it to shreds. Vincent Canby called it an unqualified disaster. Roger Ebert said it felt like being stoned to death by popcorn. United Artists folded soon after, swallowed up by MGM. Cimino didn't just bomb the darn thing, he torched the entire 70s director as God era on his way down. Studios panicked. They slapped leashes on every auteur in sight. Budgets shrank. Control changed. Cimino went from Oscar prince to industry exile overnight. But here's the interesting twist. The film didn't die. You see, years later, film nerds started poking through the wreckage, and they found something weird. Beauty. Vilmos Zsigmond's cinematography looked like oil paintings come to life. Sun-bleached plains, fog-choked towns, dirt and blood and lace. To them, this wasn't a Western. It was a slow-motion opera about class war, immigration, and the myth of American justice. So people started getting it. Cimino was making a funeral, not cowboys and outlaws. Then in 2012, Criterion dropped a restored cut, Cimino's version. Suddenly, critics started gossiping. Sight and Sound called it one of the most misunderstood films ever. Tarantino and Scorsese tipped their hats. And yeah, even the roller skating fiddle scene started hitting different. Turns out, Cimino was telling the story of the Johnson County War, real-life Wyoming class warfare where poor immigrants got steamrolled by rich cattle barons. It's sad, it's ugly, it's not fun. And in 1980, no one wanted it. But in a post-recession world, that kind of story hits harder. In simple words, Heaven's Gate didn't get better. We just caught up. So now it stands, half disaster, half masterpiece. Proof that sometimes chasing a mad vision can wreck your career and still make history. And from a mess behind the camera to family ties in front of it. Next, we've got a Western where brotherhood wasn't just on the screen. It was the screen. Number 4. The Long Riders, 1980. Let's set the scene. 1980. Westerns are limping along, wheezing for relevance in a post-Star Wars world. Then along comes Walter Hill with The Long Riders, a stylish, blood-soaked retelling of the James Younger gang saga that tried something weird, bold, and at the time, commercially suicidal. He cast actual brothers to play outlaw brothers. David, Keith, and Robert Carradine played the Youngers. James and Stacy Keach were the James boys. Dennis and Randy Quaid stepped in as the Millers, and the guests played the Ford brothers. Now, you'd think this gimmick alone would light up the box office, but it didn't. The film was shown on May 16, 1980, across 759 theaters. It rubbed together $2.35 million that opening weekend. However, the total domestic haul? Around $15.8 million, which wasn't exactly terrible, but not enough to make the studio smile, especially with a $10 million budget on the line. Now, a good chunk of the problem was due to marketing having absolutely no clue what to do with it. The trailers felt generic. The posters didn't scream "Family of Outlaws" played by actual families. They buried the hook, so critics didn't know what to make of it either. Janet Maslin called it slow and speculative, kind of like she wanted more bang for her buck. Gene Siskel, on the other hand, was sold. He praised it as proof the Western wasn't dead, just waiting for the right director to dust it off and load it up again. But here's the thing. Walter Hill wasn't playing for cheap thrills. He leaned hard into realism. For instance, the costumes were on point. The pacing was slow. The gang didn't swagger like caricatures, they felt like people. Violent, desperate, close-knit people. And that made it stick. It didn't pop off in 1980, but The Long Riders has aged like whiskey in a cellar. Western fans came back for the guts, the family dynamics, and the signature Hill style. Calm before the storm, then boom, stylized slow-mo carnage. It's operatic violence a la Peckinpah, but tighter, quieter, almost poetic. And in the end, The Long Riders became the blueprint for a new kind of Western. Less yeehaw, more elegy. And those brothers? They were the emotional engine. You felt the stakes because the blood felt real. It took years, but this one earned its legend the hard way. And speaking of hard-earned legends, if you've got room for more grit, guts, and gloriously bad decisions, slide over to Wild America, our other channel. Our new mini-series on deadly duels and dumber choices in the Old West is already drawing blood. You don't want to miss it. But for now, let's head down under, where justice decays in the heat and Nick Cave writes with a knife. Number 3. The Proposition, 2005. Now imagine if No Country for Old Men met a dustier, meaner Heart of Darkness, and then swapped Texas for the Australian outback. That's The Proposition for you. Released in 2005, this brutal gem came from director John Hillcoat and was written by none other than Nick Cave. Yes, that Nick Cave. The script bleeds sorrow, like a murder ballad turned into a film. And yet, outside Australia, barely a blip at the box office, which is wild because the movie's loaded. It stars Guy Pearce as Charlie Burns, an outlaw with a moral grenade in his lap. He has to either kill his older brother Arthur, or else the British captain will execute his younger brother Mikey. It's a family affair wrapped in barbed wire and soaked in colonial guilt. Set in the scorched hellscape of 1880s Australia, The Proposition digs deep into colonial violence, racism, and the fraying line between justice and revenge. Nick Cave's script is as vicious as it is lyrical. Think Shakespeare with blood under his fingernails. And the score, which was co-written with Warren Ellis, is pure ghost music. Sparse, haunting, it stays with you. And visually, cinematographer Benoit Delhomme turns the outback into a character of its own. Every frame looks like the land itself wants you dead. It's a slow, brooding burn where silence hits harder than gunshots. And critics loved it. The Guardian praised its honest look at colonial horror and moral rot. But audiences? Not so much. It tanked overseas. Maybe it was too depressing, too raw, too smart for its own marketing. But cult classics aren't built on ticket sales. They grow in gossip, passed between fans who say, "You have to see this." And The Proposition became that kind of film. It found its people, viewers who appreciated its guts, its quiet rage, and its refusal to clean up the past. Now it's a modern Western staple, one of the few that tackles indigenous trauma and frontier savagery without flinching or pandering. No white saviors, no cowboy glamour, just blood, dust, and impossible choices. You don't watch The Proposition for comfort. You watch it to feel something heavy. And that's why it's stuck. And now for a different kind of outlaw story, a quieter, slower, sadder one. Not only did it flop, but it made beauty out of the silence. Number 2, The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, 2007. The most beautiful box office disaster you've ever seen. This film face-planted, broke a few ribs, and then got up and asked for a Criterion release. Warner Brothers sunk $30 million into it, yet it made about half that. In 2007, audiences came looking for bang-bang outlaw chaos. What they got was a 160-minute dirge about hero worship, dread, and the death rattle of a myth. And instead of quick-draw showdowns, they got wheat fields and existential fear. The movie moved like molasses on a cold day, but good God, it was gorgeous. Roger Deakins shot it like a haunted dream. Every frame looked like it belonged in a museum, or at least on a very moody Tumblr page. Brad Pitt plays Jesse James like a man already halfway in the grave, paranoid, regal, tired of his own legend. Casey Affleck's Robert Ford, on the other hand, is an awkward storm of neediness, reverence, and quiet venom. The film, after all, wasn't entirely about outlaws. It focused on what happens when the myth gets too heavy to carry, and the fanboy holding it up wants to be part of the story. And critics didn't know what to do with it. Some hailed it as a masterpiece. Others shrugged and said it was a cowboy art film that forgot to have fun. But even the skeptics admitted, visually, it slapped. You could mute the thing and still feel something. Then came the studio panic. Warner Brothers reportedly hated the original cut. It was too slow, too sad, too weird. They chopped it, dumped it into theaters without much thought, and hoped award season would take pity. However, it didn't. But here's where it gets fun. You see, while the studio tried to pretend it didn't exist, film nerds started passing it around like contraband, bootlegs, blog posts, forums. Then, suddenly, the movie was getting the love it never got in theaters. Directors started name-dropping it. Reddit threads lit up with, "How did I miss this?" Its slow burn became its signature. It didn't care if you liked it. It asked you to lean in and sit with the silence. And if you stuck around, it rewarded you with one of the most haunting, quietly devastating westerns ever made. Today, it's got cult status and then some. Denis Villeneuve and David Lowery swear by it. Deakins called it one of his best. Even Nick Cave, who shows up in the film like a Victorian vampire and wrote the score, called it cinematic poetry. It took 15 years, but Jesse James got the last word. Not by shouting, but by gossip-mongering. And the right people finally heard it. And if you think Robert Ford was a coward, wait till you meet the other outlaws over on our other channel, Wild America. We've got plenty of frontier tales, frontier fiascos, backstabbing bandits, and more bad decisions than a saloon at midnight. So, swing by when you're feeling brave. But for now, let's wrap up this episode with the western that limped into theaters butchered and left behind a Dylan-scored ghost story about the death of the West. Number 1, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, 1973. Sam Peckinpah walked into 1973 swinging. He wanted to tell a story about two men, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, locked in a slow, sad cat-and-mouse game as the Old West died around them. But what did MGM do? They chopped it to bits. They took Peckinpah's moody, brutal, oddly poetic Western and hacked it into a confusing mess. The version that hit theaters was a stitched-together corpse. There were scenes missing, the tone wrecked, and the pacing was shot. Critics hated it. Audiences bailed. It flopped hard. But underneath the wreckage was gold. The cast? Loaded. James Coburn brought that worn-out lawman vibe like he'd lived it. Chris Christopherson oozed rebel charm as Billy. And then Bob Dylan. Yeah, that Bob Dylan. With his legendary soundtrack, he wandered into the movie as a mumbling side character named Alias and somehow made it work. That soundtrack was a funeral march for the frontier, and Knockin' on Heaven's Door, which he wrote for one scene where an old lawman dies slow in his wife's arms, is the gut punch. One of Dylan's most iconic songs, born from a movie most people ignored. Flash forward, Peckinpah's director's cut starts making the rounds. Then suddenly, the story makes sense. The slow burn tension, the aching loyalty between enemies, the creeping sense that the West is bleeding out, that all lands. Critics start gossiping, then shouting, "This was a masterpiece all along." It's not flashy, it's elegiac. Everyone's tired, everyone's losing. It's a Western about endings, of friendships, freedom, and the frontier myth itself. And Dylan? He absolutely scored the mood. His soundtrack bridges the 1800s and the 1970s in a way that makes the film feel timeless. That's why every cover of Knockin' on Heaven's Door feels like a ghost of this movie, whether it's Guns N' Roses or some guy on YouTube. And now, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid is one of the most influential Westerns of the 70s. It helped flip the genre on its head. Less bang-bang, more slow death of ideals. And in the end, although Peckinpah got dragged through studio hell, his vision made its way out of the grave. That alone earns this film its legend status. However, he wasn't alone. As you've seen so far, it turns out some Westerns don't ride off into the sunset. They get buried, and then they haunt you. It makes you wonder, how many flops are still buried out there, just waiting to be dug up from under decades of bad reviews?